Mustafar should not exist in the form we know it today. The lava, the endless eruptions, the surface that never cools, and none of it should be physically possible, and the reason it is has nothing to do with geology. Most people remember Mustafar as the place where Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader, but that moment was only a footnote in a much older and much darker story, because long before Vader ever set foot on this world, the Sith had already claimed it, not just as a stronghold, but as a secret they were determined to keep buried. They found something here, something that gave them power they could not afford to lose, and when they discovered that the damage could be undone, they made a deliberate choice to make sure it never would be. After going through both canon and legend sources, a much darker truth emerges, one that reframes everything we think we know about this planet. The Sith didn't just use Mustafar, they kept it broken on purpose. This is the full story of why. Chapter 1. A planet that shouldn't exist. Mustafar sits locked between two massive gas giants, and the gravitational pull from both subjects the planet to a process called tidal forcing. Competing gravitational fields constantly flex and compress the planetary body from the outside in, generating enormous internal friction. You can see a milder version of this on Io, one of Jupiter's moons, the most volcanically active body in our own solar system for exactly this reason. But what Io experiences and what Mustafar experiences are not the same thing. In any tidally stressed world, the energy cycles eventually find equilibrium. Material erupts, cools, resettles, and the internal pressure redistributes. Mustafar has never done this. Every simulation ever run on the planet's behavior reaches the same conclusion. The geological forces at work should have either torn the planet apart or burned themselves out long before the events of the Clone Wars. The volcanic activity is not just intense, it is constant, self-perpetuating, and operating at a sustained maximum that defies every model of natural planetary behavior. The planet should be dead. Instead, it rages. Something is feeding it deliberately. The Jedi avoided Mustafar almost entirely during the height of the Republic. The dark side saturation made it hostile territory, a place where your connection to the Force worked against you, amplifying doubt and fear in ways that could fracture even the most disciplined composure. Most historical accounts simply note that the planet was volcanic and leave it there. That explanation was never the whole story. The volcanic activity was a symptom, not a cause, and no one who accepted it as the answer ever asked why it hadn't burned itself out. The answer lies far in the past, in a time when Mustafar looked nothing like the world that forged Darth Vader. Back when it had water and forests and open skies, and back to the moment one person's grief ended all of that and left behind something that the Sith would spend centuries learning how to use. Chapter 2. The World That Was Lost. Beneath Mustafar's lava-covered surface, the evidence of a completely different world is still there if you know where to look. Deep geological scans have revealed fossilized forests buried under layers of volcanic rock, their root systems still intact, stretching across regions that are now nothing but scorched plains and rivers of molten stone. In other areas, scientists have uncovered dried basins that were once inland seas, complete with the calcified remains of aquatic species that could not survive in extreme heat. The biological record is unambiguous. This planet supported a complex, thriving ecosystem at some point in the relatively recent past. The native Mustafarians have always shown this. Their oldest oral traditions speak of a time called the Bright Star, an era when the world was filled with water, with open skies not yet choked by ash, with vegetations and light and the kind of stability that lets a culture build and remember across generations. For a long time, the wider galaxy dismissed these stories as mythology. The geological record proves they were not. The Bright Star was real, and the person who ended it wasn't a conqueror. She was someone trying to save the person she loved. Her name was Lady Corvox. She was Force-sensitive, powerful, and consumed entirely by grief. Her husband had died, and she refused to accept that death as final. That impulse is not unique in the history of the Force. The desire to reach past death, to undo loss, to recover what was taken, it appears again and again in the stories of those who interact with the Force at the deepest levels. What made Corvox different was not the grief itself, it was what she found to act on it. The Aeon Engine was an ancient piece of Force-based technology, unlike anything else documented in galactic history. Its precise origins are unclear, but its function was extraordinary. The device could interface directly with the life energy of an entire planetary body, not the Force connection of individual beings, but the accumulated biological and spiritual energy of a whole world, its ecosystems, its creatures, the resonance built up over centuries of organic life existing in relationship with a place. She believed she could use it to reach past death. What she didn't know was what the attempt would cost everyone else. Corvox believed she could draw on that energy and redirect it towards something the Force had taken from her. If the device could tap into the full life resonance of a living planet, perhaps the boundary between life and death could be weakened enough to pull someone back through it. This is the same reasoning that would draw Vader to Mustafar thousands of years later. It is the same logic Palpatine used when he whispered to Anakin about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis. The desire to reverse death through Force-based intervention is not an invention of the dark side. It is something close to a universal impulse, and the dark side has always known how to use it. Corvox was not a Sith. She was someone in agony who found a tool that seemed to offer a way through that agony and used it without fully understanding what she was holding. The horror of what happened to Mustafar is not that it was done by a monster, it is that it was done by someone who loved deeply, reached too far, and left an entire world paying the price for that reach. The attempt failed catastrophically. Instead of drawing energy outward, the Aeon Engine destabilized and turned inward. It began consuming the planet rather than channeling it, pulling thermal, biological, and Force energy simultaneously into an accelerating feedback loop. The planet's core ignited. Tectonic systems that had been stable for millennia fractured in sequence. Oceans evaporated, forests burned to nothing in hours. The bright star didn't fade, it was extinguished in hours, and the damage didn't stop when the fires did. The atmosphere, once clear enough for open skies, thickened into toxic ash that would not clear for thousands of years. The bright star that the Mustafarians' ancestors had known, the open skies, the water, the living world, was gone in the span of a single catastrophe. Corvox had not saved her husband. She had destroyed an entire world in the attempt, and she had done it alone. Every living thing that died in the transformation fed that wound and made it deeper. Mustafar was not simply destroyed, it became something else entirely. And that something else was exactly what the Sith had been looking for. Chapter 3: The Corvox Catastrophe. The Sith did not stumble onto Mustafar, they were drawn to it. A wound in the Force of the scale created by the Corvox catastrophe does not go unnoticed by beings who spend their lives attuned to dark side energy. The versions that formed at the side of the Aeon Engine's failure was not a subtle disturbance, it was a concentrated rupture. A place where the membrane between the physical world and the Force had been torn thin by the violent death of an entire biosphere. For a Jedi, this would register as a place to avoid. For the Sith, it registered as something they had never found before, a natural amplifier, a source of raw dark side power that required no construction, no ritual, no maintenance. Vergences exist throughout the galaxy. The cave beneath the ancient tree on Dagobah is one. The wellspring beneath the Jedi Temple on Coruscant is another. Most of them form gradually, the accumulated resonance of significant events or of Force-sensitive beings spending centuries in a single location. The Mustafar Vergence was different in kind. It did not accumulate gradually, it was created in an instant, in a catastrophic discharge of Force energy that left the site permanently saturated with dark power. That origin gave it qualities that could not be replicated artificially: raw volatility, extreme concentration, and a sustained instability that made dark side techniques feel effortless in a way they did not anywhere else in the galaxy. Rituals conducted there were stronger. Artifacts stored there absorbed and held dark side charge in ways that artifacts elsewhere simply could not. The planet functioned as an amplification system, and the Sith moved quickly to claim it. Artifacts of immense power were transported there and buried beneath the surface, where the Virgins would preserve and strengthen them indefinitely. Experiments were conducted in the volcanic depths, explorations of dark side capability that required the kind of energy concentration only Mustafar could provide. Texts and techniques and histories that the Sith considered too volatile to risk in locations the Jedi might find were encoded and stored there. For generations, the arrangement held. The Sith grew stronger. Their artifacts deepened in charge. Their rituals reached levels of power that would have been impossible anywhere else. And the Mustafarians, adapted to their volcanic world and unaware of what lay beneath their feet, continued to survive inside a catastrophe that someone else had decided was too useful to end. It was, by any measure, a perfect arrangement, which is exactly why the Sith spent so much effort making sure it can never change. For the Sith, it was nearly perfect, nearly because the power they were drawing on was not a stable resource. Every dark side tradition understood, at some level, that vergences were not permanent features of a landscape. They were concentrations of force energy that had accumulated under specific conditions. Change those conditions, and the vergens change with them. Mustafar's vergens was sustained by the Aeon Engine's ongoing disruption of the planet's force resonance, a disruption that the planet's own natural processes would eventually work to correct, the same way any wound, left alone, eventually begins to close. The Sith were sophisticated enough to understand this, and that understanding forced them towards the most consequential decision they would ever make on Mustafar. The Vergence was only this powerful because the wound was still open. A heal Mustafar, a world where the Aeon Engine's damage had been reversed, where the ecosystems had recovered, and the force resonance had returned to something balanced, would not have generated this kind of dark side energy. The power came from the ongoing rupture. It came from the sustained, unresolved catastrophe. Sith philosophy has always held that strength justifies its own exercise. On Mustafar, that philosophy reached one of its most extreme conclusions. It is worth pausing on the full weight of that. The Sith were not ignorant of what Mustafar had been. The geological and force-based evidence of a once-living world was not hidden from them. They were among the most thorough researchers of planetary history in the galaxy. They knew the Mustafarians had survived. They knew an entire culture had adapted to conditions that should never have been permanent. They knew, when they found the Aeon Engine, that there was a path back to what the planet had been. And they made a decision, not out of ignorance, not out of necessity, but out of calculation. Chapter 4. Why the Sith chose Mustafar. At some point during their occupation of Mustafar, the Sith made a discovery that should have changed the planet's fate. The Aeon Engine was still there, buried beneath the volcanic surface, damaged but intact. The device that had caused the catastrophe had survived it. Sith scholars and archaeologists eventually located it and assessed its condition, and what they found would have been extraordinarily good news to anyone who did not have a vested interest in keeping Mustafar broken. The damage was not permanent. The Aeon Engine could be repaired. The engineering required was not simple, and the process would have demanded significant time and resources, but it was achievable. More importantly, a repaired engine would not simply stop draining the planet. Because of the way the device interfaced with planetary life force, a functional Aeon Engine running in its intended mode would actively reverse the damage it had caused. The volcanic activity would subside as the tectonic system stabilized. The dark side vergence, sustained entirely by the ongoing rupture, would dissipate as the wound in the force began to close. Given enough time, the ecosystems could return. The planet could breathe again. Mustafar could be restored to what it had been before Corvox activated the engine. The Sith did not repair it, and that single decision condemned an entire world to thousands more years of destruction. A living Mustafar would have been worthless to them. The entire basis of the planet's value as a stronghold was the Vergence, and the Vergence existed because the wound existed. Restoring the planet would have eliminated the very thing that made it useful. So instead, they did something methodical and deliberate. They made sure the wound could never close. There is a distinction here that matters. The Sith did not cause what happened in Mustafar. Corvox caused it, alone, driven by grief, and by a technology she did not fully understand. The Sith bore no responsibility for the original catastrophe. What they are responsible for is every decision they made after the moment they understood what the Aeon Engine represented and chose to leave it buried. The original destruction was an accident. What followed was a policy. For thousands of years, every Sith presence on Mustafar operated under a system deliberately designed to prevent the planet from ever recovering. Every ritual conducted there, every artifact stored there, every piece of dark-side knowledge encoded and hidden in the volcanic depths, all of it ran on power that depended on a wound staying open that the Sith had specifically chosen to keep that way. Sith artifacts known as dark-side totems were placed at calculated positions across the planet's surface. These were not decorative markers, they were functional anchors, devices engineered specifically to channel dark-side energy into the planet's wound and reinforce the conditions maintaining it. Each totem held a corruption in place, suppressed the natural processes that would otherwise have begun drawing the rupture closed, and ensured that the volcanic activity and dark side saturation remained at the intensity the Sith required. The system was not passive. It required ongoing maintenance and intent. The Sith were not simply exploiting a damaged world, they were actively managing its damage, day after day, century after century, to make sure it never healed. The implications, spelled out plainly, were difficult to ignore. They looked at an entire civilization living inside ongoing destruction and decided that destruction was more valuable than the people suffering through it. The Mustafarians kept their oral traditions alive through all of it. They maintained the memory of the bright star and told their children about a green world that existed before the burning, a world they had no reason to expect would ever return. And all of that time, buried beneath the surface of their home, was a device that could have ended their suffering, surrounded by a network of Sith artifacts specifically designed to make sure it never would. That was the dark truth the Sith buried on Mustafar, and Vader would soon arrive to push it further than anyone before him had dared. Chapter 5: Vader's Fortress. Darth Vader chose Mustafar not as a monument to his past and not as a symbol of his fall. He chose it as a tool, a mechanism he believed could do something no other location in the galaxy was capable of doing. He wanted to use the wound in the Force to reach through death itself. The full story of how the fortress was built is documented in the Darth Vader comic series by Charles Soule. It begins with a spirit named Momin, an ancient Sith Lord whose consciousness had been preserved in a mask that Darth Sidious gave to Vader. Momin had spent centuries trapped in the object, waiting for a host and a purpose. Vader provided both. His expertise was architecture as a Force instrument. He understood, at a level no one else had mapped, how physical structures could be designed to channel, concentrate, and direct Force energy. Vader gave him Mustafar, the most powerful dark-side versions in the known galaxy, and a single directive: build something that could open a door between the living world and the dead one. The construction took years. Early versions of the fortress had failed repeatedly, each collapse caused by the structure's inability to handle the volume of dark-side energy rising from the virgins below. Mustafarian workers died in the backlash. Momin kept iterating, each failure feeding information back into the next attempt. What eventually emerged was not a castle in any conventional sense. Every element of its architecture served the same function. The towers were positioned not for aesthetics, but to catch and redirect the dark-side energy rising from the planet's wound. The angles of the walls, the depth of the foundation shafts, the geometry of the internal chambers, all of it was engineered to draw the virgins upward from beneath the surface, concentrate it through the structure, and focus it into a single point deep in the complex. The whole building was a lens. The virgins was the light it was focusing. Vader had not built a home on Mustafar, he had built a machine designed to break the boundary between life and death. His fall to the dark side had been built entirely around the fear of losing Padme and everything Palpatine had told him about the dark side's power over death had been aimed at exactly that fear. Vader had lived for years knowing the promise was hollow, that Padme had died, that the dark side had not saved her, that everything he had destroyed had been destroyed for nothing. The fortress was his attempt to prove that the power was real after all, not to undo what had happened, but to reach her, to find whatever remained of her on the other side of death and make some form of contact with it. Two people, separated by thousands of years, both driven to the same world by the same grief. Corvox and Vader, both attempting to use the same wound in the Force to reach past death to someone they had lost. Corvox used the Aeon Engine and destroyed a world in the attempt. Vader used a fortress designed by a Sith spirit and failed more quietly, withdrawing from the threshold with whatever he had encountered on the other side, locked away in a silence he never broke. The dark side could pull at the boundary between life and death and make it temporarily thin, but it cannot do what either of them needed it to do. The wound in the Force is not a door. It cannot be made into one, no matter how precisely the architecture is designed or how much power is concentrated through it. And what the fortress reveals, across the whole arc of Mustafar's history, is the logical endpoint of everything the Sith had been building toward since they first set foot on this planet. They found a wound and chose to keep it open. They built a system to hold that wound against the natural forces that would have closed it. Their greatest lord then built a machine directly over that wound and tried to reach through it into death. Each step follows from the last, each a more extreme version of the same impulse, the belief that the dark side's power over suffering is the same as power over the Force. The fortress is that philosophy made physical, and like the philosophy, it reached its absolute limit the moment it was pushed furthest. The ritual was activated. The energy of the Virgin surged through the fortress at full intensity. For a moment, and the comics render this with a quiet devastation the films never matched, the barrier between the living Force and what lies beyond it began to thin, and Vader stepped through. He reached something. He experienced something on the other side that the comic leaves deliberately ambiguous, whether it was Padme, a shadow of her, something darker wearing her shape, or simply the confirmation that the boundary could not be crossed. But it did not work. The attempt collapsed. Vader withdrew. The fortress stood intact, its architecture still fully functional, its purpose now permanently unrealized. He never came back to try again. A man who had destroyed everything in pursuit of a single promise had pushed that promise as far back as it could go, in the one place in the galaxy most designed to make it possible, and come back alone. The dark side had not lied to him about the power. It had simply never told him what the power could not do. Chapter 6. The Secret the Sith Hid. The Sith found the Aeon Engine and made a choice that most accounts of this planet never fully reckon with. They did not destroy it, did not fear it, did not hide it out of ignorance. They assessed it with full knowledge of what it was, concluded that a repaired engine would cost them everything they had built on this planet, and decided to ensure it can never be used again. But every system built on suppression has a breaking point, and when the Sith finally fell, Mustafar would begin doing something no one alive had ever seen it do, something that proved everything the Sith had built here was never as permanent as they believed. That story is next. Chapter 7. A Planet Beginning to Heal. With the fall of the Sith, the system they had spent centuries building to keep Mustafar broken began to come apart. The dark side totems anchored across the planet's surface were not passive structures. They required the active current of Sith practice and intent flowing through them to hold the wound open. When the Sith fell, when Sidious died at Exegol and the order he had maintained collapsed, that current broke. The totems began to fail, not immediately since these were ancient structures with deep roots in the planet's geology and Force resonance, but progressively. One anchor point weakened, then another. Then, the system as a whole began to lose the coherence that had made it effective for so long. No one directed this. No one activated anything. The structures the Sith had built simply stopped receiving what they needed to function, and without them, Mustafar was left alone with its own nature for the first time in millennia. And for the first time in thousands of years, the planet began to answer. And as the artificial system failed, the natural one began to reassert itself. The volcanic cycles that had been sustained at maximum intensity by the anchored wound started to moderate. Lava flows that had been continuous for as long as anyone alive could remember began to slow and cool in sections, leaving solid ground where there had been none. The atmosphere, choked for millennia with volcanic particulate and dark side resonance, began to thin in certain regions. Not dramatically, not uniformly across the whole planet, but measurably. And then, in areas where the lava had cooled long enough for stable ground to form, and where the atmosphere had shifted enough to allow for something other than ash, plant life began to appear. Mosses first, then ground cover, small and isolated at first, the kind of pioneer organisms that colonize newly stable ground before anything more complex can follow. But present, alive, on a world that had not supported visible plant life in thousands of years. This was not just recovery, this was proof that everything the Sith had built on Mustafar had been a lie. If Mustafar's condition had been the result of natural forces, the tidal compression from the gas giants, the instability of its orbital position, then the fall of the Sith would have changed nothing. The planet would have kept burning regardless of what happened to its most recent occupants, because natural forces do not respond to political events. The gravitational relationship between Mustafar and the gas giants on either side of it was not affected by Sidious dying at Exegol, but Mustafar began to heal the moment the Sith-built system maintaining its destruction failed. That is not a coincidence, that is causation. The wound was artificial, the maintenance was real, and without the maintenance, the planet began to do what it would have done centuries earlier if the Sith had not intervened. It started recovering. The Mustafarians noticed. Their oral traditions, which had carried the memory of the bright star across thousands of years of volcanic darkness, began to take on a different quality, not just memory of what had been lost, but something closer to anticipation. The elders who maintained the stories of the green world for generations they had no reason to believe would see any change began to speak differently about what might still be possible. For the first time in thousands of years, the bright star was not just a memory, it was beginning to look like a direction. Whether that recovery will ever reach the scale of what Mustafar was before the Corvox catastrophe is a question that remains genuinely open. The Aeon Engine is still buried somewhere beneath the surface. Whether anyone will ever locate it, repair it, and use it as Corvox intended, to restore rather than drain, is not answered by current canon. But the direction has changed, and the reason it changed tells you everything you need to know about what the Sith actually were on this planet. They found a world that someone else had broken by accident. They found a device that could have fixed it, chose to leave it buried, and spent centuries actively suppressing any chance of recovery because a broken Mustafar made them stronger than a living one ever could. They built totems to hold the wound open. They raised a fortress over it and tried to reach through it into death. They kept an entire people living inside destruction that existed only because their suffering was useful. The Mustafarians told their children about the bright star for thousands of years, never knowing that the reason it could not return was because someone had made sure it wouldn't. The Sith were wrong about a great many things, but the most consequential thing they were wrong about was this: that wounds held open by Force stay open forever. They don't. The moment the Force holding Mustafar broken was removed, the planet began to prove it. The Force does not remain broken forever, not because of some abstract guarantee, but because the structures that hold wounds open are mortal. They depend on the beings who built them remaining in power, remaining committed to a philosophy of extraction that eventually consumes the people practicing it as thoroughly as it consumes everything around them. The Sith built their power on a wound in the Force. When they were gone, the wound began to close, and Mustafar, slowly, imperfectly, and against all the odds of its own history, began to remember what it had been. The bright star that the Mustafarians had kept alive in history for thousands of years was not just a memory of the past, it was, finally, a description of what was coming. If this story pulled you in, the next chapters go even deeper. We've already explored the full rise and fall of the Sith, from their earliest beginnings to their final collapse, in our complete timeline documentary. That's the perfect place to continue. And if you want to dive even further into their origins, power struggles, and the moment that shaped the dark side itself, check out our Dawn of the Sith timeline. Both videos expand the story beyond Mustafar and reveal how the Sith rose and why they always fell.